Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. I'm your host, Rachel Sherlock, and for this episode, we've got something slightly different to our usual format. Last week, I was fortunate enough to give a paper at the fall conference held by the Nicola Institute for Ethics and Culture at Notre Dame University. The whole panel was recorded and will be put up on YouTube in the coming months, and I will be sure to share the link for that then when it is available so that you can see all the papers and also my slides and some extra bits and pieces. But in the meantime, I thought I would share my own recording of my section of the panel. To give some background on the event and my paper, this year's Ethics and Culture Conference was held in conjunction with the Biennial Catholic Imagination Conference, and the theme was Ever Ancient, Ever New on Catholic Imagination. And the focus of the conference was kind of mainly on the literary arts, and so my paper was part of a panel on the author Graham Greene, and my talk was titled The Ends of the Affairs, Medieval Ideals, Modern Trysts, and the Offering of Redemption in the Works of Graham Greene and T.H. White. Long-time listeners of the show will see that I managed to combine Graham Greene with one of my pet favourite books, The Once and Future King by T.H. White. So, before we get to the recording, I have a couple of pieces of housekeeping that I want to get to. Firstly, our regular listeners might have noticed that the podcast has not returned to its usual schedule this autumn. My apologies for this. I am working to organise a somewhat new schedule and setup for the podcast. Nothing dramatic, I promise, but that will hopefully be starting in the new year. And until then, I'm kind of bridging the gap between now and then. So I very much hope and intend to be speaking with you again before Christmas, but just thank you very much for bearing with me until then. Secondly, as you might have guessed, it was a fairly ad hoc recording of the event. I'm pretty pleased with the sound quality. It definitely could be a lot worse, but obviously it's not up to the usual standards, so apologies for the background noises and the small quirks that you can hear. I hope that it is still worth listening to anyway. And just to say, along with my paper, I've also included the questions which were directed to me in the Q&A section at the end of the panel. And finally, I just wanted to say some thank yous. I was really thrilled to be part of this event, and so I want to thank everyone involved in organising it for having me be a part of it. It was such a fantastic conference with so many great talks and speakers, and I feel really privileged to be among them. I would like to thank my fellow panelists, especially Joshua McManaway, who you will hear sharing in some of the responses to the questions, as his paper was also on Graham Greene's The End of the Affair. And last, but certainly not least, I want to thank my friends who encouraged me to submit, who helped me to record the talk, and most importantly, took planes, trains, and automobiles to come cheer me on at this event. I am really so grateful. And with all of that said, I hope you enjoy the talk, and I will be back with another episode of Risking Enchantment soon.
And lastly, Rachel Sherlock, The Ends of the Affairs, Medieval Ideals, Modern Trysts, and the Offering of Redemption in the Works of Graham Greene and T.H. White. Let's get started.
For this paper, I will be looking at Graham Greene's The End of the Affair, the fourth and last of his so-called Catholic novels, and T.H. White's retelling of the Arthurian myth cycle, The Once and Future King. If these books seem like strange bedfellows, then it is perhaps fitting for a talk about adultery and affairs. At first glance, it is true that they seem like unlikely comparative texts, even if they were published in the same decade. Given that this is a Graham Greene panel, I expect those here will be more likely to be familiar with The End of the Affair. Greene's masterpiece explores the relationships of writer Maurice Bendrix and Sarah Miles and her husband, civil servant Henry Miles, charting Bendrix's and Sarah's illicit union, its aftermaths, and its spiritual implications. The Once and Future King takes somewhat more explanation, even justification, for its place in a discussion on Catholic imagination. T.H. White was not Catholic, although tellingly, while writing this book, he gave serious consideration to entering the church. But more importantly, perhaps, White gives astounding life to the Arthurian world, a world for which the Church's teachings and sacraments were profoundly real. The book is a sprawling epic, interweaving elements of fairy tales with complex questions of the founding of chivalric codes and civilization. But at its centre are tragic and complex personal stories, most notably that of Lancelot and his affair with Queen Guinevere. These two stories, despite their apparent differences in setting, tone, and style, in fact share many threads and themes, although they often approach them from opposite directions. In The End of the Affair, Sarah and Bendrix are thoroughly modern. They make no attempt at, and even have no desire for moral excellence. They have no relationship with God, barely even a conscious rejection of him. And their relationship begins as an affair in the tawdriest sense, one in a long line of affairs casually entered into. Yet they happen to find a kernel of real love for each other, a love which cannot be truly expressed in their illicit and modern configuration. Then, in a moment of catastrophe, God enters the picture, giving response to a prayer and a vow. The world of high ideals has come into play, and Sarah wrestles with the true reality of God, and vice falls away to be replaced by painfully hard-won virtues. On the other hand, in The Once and Future King, Arthur's kingdom is achingly and meticulously crafted to foster virtue. Words of honour, vows, expectation of conduct are held to sometimes tragic degrees. But Lancelot cannot reconcile the ideals of his age with the actions of his love affair, which is not only dishonourable, but ultimately destroys everything he holds dear. As White writes, to a medieval nature like Lancelot, with its fatal weakness for loving the highest when he saw it, this was a position of pain. He could not bear to be made to feel that his sentiment for Guinevere was an ignoble sentiment. The hasty moments together, the locked doors and base contrivances, the guilty manoeuvres which the husband's presence forced on the lovers, these had the effect of soiling what had no excuse unless it was beautiful. This key hypocrisy of the Arthurian myths is in fact spotlighted by Graham Greene in The End of the Affair, when Bendrix asks the name of the son of the private detective he hires to follow Sarah. The hapless Mr. Parkes replies that the boy is called Lance. After Sir Lancelot, sir, of the Round Table. I'm surprised, that was a rather unpleasant affair, surely. You found the Holy Grail, Mr. Parkes said. That was Galahad. Lancelot was found in bed with Guinevere. It is these seeming contradictions that unite both stories. That real love might be found in sinful beginnings, and that sinful habits might persist in principled people. That old-fashioned ideas of virtue and morals might break through our modern world of self-satisfaction, and that these problems of sinfulness have plagued humanity even in our noblest myths. To begin with, we should first look at the two love stories. Despite the salacious premise of extramarital affairs, neither the characters nor the novel's readers are involved in a fantasy romance of cheap titillation. Sarah and Guinevere, the objects of desire, are without question beautiful, and yet are hardly described in ways recognizable from fashion magazines or, dare I say, pornography. In describing Sarah's particular beauty, Bendrix mentions only her broad forehead and bold mouth, the conformation of the skull. White takes his mythic characters, but instead of wreathing them in a hagiographic glow, he makes a point of grounding them in reality, focusing on them in their middle age. In one particularly moving scene, White says, Guinevere had overdressed for the occasion. She had put on a makeup she did not need, and put it on badly. She was 42. Here the paramours are viscerally real people, full of realistic and even unflattering details. The love they share for each other is not based on a self-gratifying fantasy in their mind, but truly for a person in front of them, warts and all. So much so that White takes it one step further. In one of the masterstrokes of his rewriting, he takes the dashing, handsome figure of Lancelot and instead gives him the face of a monster. This ugliness lies at the centre of Lancelot's pursuit to become the best knight as he reacts against the thing which must have gone wrong in the depths of his spirit to make a face like that. These people with their physical reality and depth also have a depth of character and spirit. They recognize their own brokenness and their astonishment at finding themselves lovable and indeed beloved. Bendrix, in The End of the Affair, says, It's a strange thing to discover and to believe that you are loved when you know that there is nothing in you for anybody but a parent or a God to love. But the novel plays out almost the reverse of this quote. It is by first loving and being loved by Bendrix that brings Sarah in contact with the transcendent love that is the person of God. Indeed, the very carnal nature of the relationship she shares with Bendrix helps her encounter the reality of the incarnation. Finding herself in a Catholic church, she reflects, I hated the statues, the crucifix, all the emphasis on the human body. I was trying to escape from the human body and all it needed. I thought I could believe in some kind of a God that bore no relation to ourselves, something vague, amorphous, cosmic, like a powerful vapor. So today I looked at that material body on that material cross and I wondered, how could the world have nailed a vapor there? A vapor, of course, felt no pain and no pleasure. Could anybody love him or hate him if he hadn't got a body? Encountering God as a person, rather than a vapor, renders his love for us as deeply personal. Suddenly his love is no cosmic given, but demands a response, and in fact is infinitely more shocking than that of an earthly lover. This is the chink through which grace enters in the end of the affair. The encountering with a real person and responding with real love prepares the heart, however resistant, to the idea of love as a transcendent reality, one which is not only personal but is in fact a person, Jesus Christ. As we might expect, the once and future king approaches from the opposite direction, as Lancelot's love for God precedes his love for Guinevere. The knight's trouble from his childhood, which he never completely grew out of, was that for him, God was a real person. He was not an abstraction who punished you if you were wicked or rewarded you if you were good, but a real person like Guinevere or like Arthur or like anybody else. Lancelot had a definite idea of what he looked like and how he felt, and he was somehow in love with this person. This makes his story all the more tragic as he spends decades torn between the God and the woman he loves. Especially as a chivalric knight, he is also deeply in touch with other transcendent realities, such as the binding nature of his honor and his word. If God, who is the Word incarnate, is real, so too are his covenants and vows, as are the vows we make to him. Sarah must reckon with this following her earnest prayer for Bendrix, a prayer which she recognizes requires sacrifice and so becomes a vow. I'll give him up forever, only let him be alive. In the granting of this prayer, she must now live out the consequences. At first, she tries to dismiss it with our modern disdain for the reality of vows. A vow's not all that important. A vow to somebody I've never known, to somebody I don't really believe in. Against this seemingly modern, rational thinking, God's hand is at work in her heart until she begins to believe. Begins by hating God, because his reality requires her to keep her vow. But even in raging against him, she acknowledges, I have free will to break my promise, haven't I? But I haven't the power to gain anything from breaking it. You let me sin, but you take away the fruits of my sin. Similarly, and deeply embedded with these vows, both stories play out the real consequences of sacraments, baptism, confession, and most obviously marriage. We see the danger of entering into marriage for any lesser cause, whether that's the alliance of kingdoms or the convenience of companionship. For the vows of marriage cannot simply be wished away should true love appear, but neither can such a love be dismissed out of hand, even when found in the most illicit and impermissible of settings. For as we see in the end of the affair, love remains the unsuspecting entry point to transcendent and divine realities, one that still slips under the watch of our modern world. This is elucidated beautifully by Bendrix, who says, I can imagine if there existed a God who loved, the devil would be driven to destroy even the weakest, most faulty imitation of that love. Wouldn't he be afraid that the habit of love might grow, and wouldn't he try to trap us all into being traitors, into helping him extinguish love? But even the devil's methods of destruction point us towards God. The themes of jealousy and possession run throughout both books, and their destructive qualities are all the more potent for the adulterous lovers who cannot earnestly possess their lover. And yet this points us towards the jealous God to whom we owe our existence, and yet holds no force over us, but invites us to love him freely. Another of the devil's tools, doubt, is similarly destructive. Grappling with the uncertainty of love, the devil seeks to play on our fears and so rush love towards its destruction. The two books have several mirroring quotes in this regard. Of Guinevere in The Once and Future King, White writes, "Seeing so much further into the future than he did, she pressed towards it with passionate tread, wrecking the present, because the future was bound to be a wreck." While Bendrick states, "When the sense of insecurity, the logical belief in the hopeless future descended like melancholia, I would badger her, as though I wanted to bring the future in now at the door, an unwanted and premature guest." To escape their fear of love ending, they poison it themselves, choosing despair, which always feels more certain than hope. But once again, does even that doubt and fear of the end of love not point to the answer, that our hearts are yearning for an eternal love? This is not at all to say that these stories offer saccharine slogans of true love conquering all, and that all pursuits of such love inevitably bring us closer to the divine. Rather, these stories portray an almost unbearably hard road towards God, a path complicated by it necessarily involving another person, one who is deeply loved but who must in some sense be forsaken and abandoned. Further, this other person is not hearing the call to God. They see no reason to give up their lover and so fight the ending of the relationship, using their sway to test their beloved's resolve. While one is drawing closer to God, the other feels driven away from him. We find another of those parallel quotes between the books. From Bendrix we hear, "She mixes religion with desertion to make it sound noble to herself." While of Guinevere we hear, "Holiness, selfishness," she cried to herself, "selfish to abandon another's soul so as to save your own." And this is the key point, that the greater good and greater duty being recognized by one party does not eliminate the desires and the demands of the other. As Guinevere puts it, "It took two to make a renunciation, just as it took two to make love or to make a quarrel. But your lover's soul was not your own. It was not at your disposal. You had a duty towards it." This duty is not imagined, even if its beginning is immoral. It highlights the grave consequences, often so mindlessly entered into, of binding yourself to someone. Tellingly, Lancelot, although already racked with temptation, does not begin his affair with Guinevere until after he himself has been coerced and duped into bed with Elaine. This spurs Lancelot into despair. Having lost his purity, he may as well be impure with his heart's desire. But once entangled, he cannot again extricate himself from Guinevere and the duties of love to her, or even from Elaine. Here his pride at his moral and chivalric excellence keeps him from enacting what feels like cruelty against these women. Because God demands that we love him better than our loved ones on earth, and that we should love their eternal salvation more than their present need. The demand is to truly love and yet willfully leave, a demand requiring so much sacrifice it is hard not to find cruel. But with this extreme of moral expectations, we also find the extremes of God's love and mercy. For the love story that rests behind that of these illicit affairs is the love of God for us, his restless pursuit of our souls. As our fictional paramours here find that their love for each other transcends the earthly and reaches towards the divine, so in turn do they find that God's divine love for them reaches towards them into their earthly reality. For both these books are stories about miracles, perhaps to be expected in Arthurian romances, but even the end of the affair has almost the air of a medieval saint's life with its faith healings and apparitions. These miracles point to the way that God's love pursues us in great climactic moments, but also in tiny moments, a cough that suddenly interrupts a kiss. What compels us about these miracles is the length God goes to woo those in the depths of sin. Sarah never prayed and never believed. God still heard and answered her. I said, "Let him be alive," not believing in you, and my disbelief made no difference to you. You took it into your love and accepted it like an offering. For Sarah, this was her first conscious encounter with God, and although painful, it marks a transformation point. But Lancelot, who loved God from the start, abandons his dream of performing miracles because it requires him to be pure of heart, and instead chooses his affair with Guinevere. Despite this, God pursues Lancelot with miracles of his own. In one of the most moving sections of the book, Sir Ur, a knight with an incurable malady, requests Lancelot to try a miraculous healing, and the crowds gather to watch, for how could Lancelot, the best knight in the world, fail? Here White writes, "Think that you know of a good reason for your failure, which you have tried pathetically to hide and overlook for 25 years. The people outside are waiting for you to do this miracle, because you have traded on their belief that your heart was pure. And now, with treachery and adultery and murder wringing the heart like a cloth, you are to go out into the sunlight for the test of honour." And yet our own sins and abasements are not the end of the story, for Christ's love proves greater than Lancelot's sin. The knight is healed, and the crowd goes wild with excitement, while, in the middle, quite forgotten, her lover was kneeling by himself. This lonely and motionless figure knew a secret which was hidden from the others. The miracle was that he had been allowed to do a miracle. And there with the weeping Lancelot we find the greatest miracle of all, God's unending love for us, the realization that no magnitude of sin places us outside of God's desire, but at the same time no smallness of sin can be left untransformed and unredeemed. Even the atheist Bendrix recognizes that his pettishness and meanness are greater stumbling blocks to his redemption than his adultery. But whether great or small, our sins do not preclude us from being called to be united in love with Christ. What remains is our response. For as Bendrix says, addressing Sarah in his mind, "What I chiefly felt was less hate than fear. For if this God exists, I thought, and if even you, with your lusts and your adulteries and the timid lies you used to tell, can change like this, we could all be saints, by leaping as you leapt, by shutting the eyes and leaping once and for all. If you are a saint, it's not so difficult to be a saint. It's something he can demand of any of us. Leap." What is our response to this demand? Do we dare allow our corrupt and petty attempts at love to be transformed? Do we have the courage to face the demands that this transformed love places on us? Shall we shut our eyes and leap?
That was the first series of papers. You can only imagine what is to come. We have 13 minutes now for conversations and questions around these essays. I do ask, especially if you can try some of your questions to link some of the essays together. That always makes for better conversation.
Yeah, so this is a question for maybe both Joshua and Rachel. There's something really interesting to me in the notion of a disordered love leading a person in the right direction, but at some kind of at the cost of burning up what's disordered about it. And it strikes me that in some ways this process is can be very kind of halting and incomplete. I mean, in T.H. White's book, after that moment with the miracle, Lancelot gets into a lot more trouble. I'm not so sure about the Greene, but I guess I'm just wondering, is there something here about, is it just that God can use anything, or do you think there's something particular about the fact of like romantic love, or like the particular kind of structure of the thing that they both share here, the fact that it's a love for another person? Is it just any disordered thing can point you towards God by God's providence, or is there something particular about this kind of love that you think has this effect?
Okay. So I think, I go to Genesis 50, what Joseph says to his brothers, "What you intended for evil, God intended for good." Yes, God's providence will outdo every bad thing that you bring to the table, right? He loves you more than you dislike yourself enough to sin. And so there is, I think, a particular potency, though, to romantic love, which is why, these authors tap into it. I mean, for me, the turning point for Sarah in the end of the affair is when she and Morris make honest-to-God love. And she says, I'll never love anyone like I've loved you. Right? That's the turning point. This isn't just one of her other affairs, because Henry doesn't pay attention. She now actually cares for another human being. And Morris describes it as abandoning herself. It's ecstasy, standing outside of yourself. And when you do that, you realize, oh, there are other things. You can't be so solipsistic anymore. God worked right in that moment, If you can love like this, guess what? The transcendent orientation of that love is me.
Yeah, I think that is pretty much the sum of what I would say as well. I think, especially if you look at the end of the affair, the kind of modern world that they find themselves in is so tawdry and mundane. I think it's really summed up in the way that Bendrix and Sarah use this code word of onions to describe love, which is so deeply unromantic. I think love, like a real encounter with love, is one of the few things that can shake you out of that mundane reality in order to point you to the divine. Whereas I do think, as you said, and you said in your talk as well, that the vices can resemble or be inversions of the virtues. So I can absolutely believe that God can use anything. It's just that romantic love is one of the things that most people tend to encounter in their lives that actually might shake them out of their kind of numbness of living.
Knowing that we have 3 minutes left and we have 2 questions, could we get both questions out on the table and then let folks answer them?
Well, thank you. It was really wonderful to hear all. Very exciting to hear what you had to say. I was thinking about, there's a lot of things I have to say. I'm just going to leave into one then. The incarnation as a kind of way of proceeding into ordered love seems to be part of Augustine. It seems to be part, certainly, of Bernanos and Greene. So I was just taken with the fact that it is these sexual bodies. It's the body that then makes some kind of transcendence possible, right? It's this idea of saving another person's body of the Madame, or it's about Sarah and Bendrix, or it's about, So there's this, I guess my question is, how does that doctrine of the incarnation really kind of remind the Catholic that transcendence is not about leading something, but it's about filling something. It's about fulfilling something. It's about bodies more than it's about going somewhere. Does that make sense?
Yeah. My question is also an everyone question following up on this one, about erotic desire and desire for God. So my question always when reading Augustine is kind of when he's talking about his disordered erotic desires until he converts, famously saying, "Give me chastity, but not now." Is the source of desire, is the source for his erotic desire and the source for his desire for God the same? Because Plato seems to say in the Republic something similar, right? When he compares desire to kind of like water flowing, which can go in several directions, and that would maybe seem to be the case of the priest in The Power and the Glory.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to what you were saying. That I think it's just to make a note that I think it's really interesting, and I think that Greene does a great job of exploring that in the end of the affair. There was one quote that I had to cut that I loved, which was about, did I ever love Morris as much as before I loved you, or was it really you that I loved all along? Mm-hmm. And I think that's so moving in seeing the destination beyond where our desires start, and that movement from where it begins, which is in our kind of corrupt nature, and goes beyond into the divine. And to say about the incarnation as well, just that, I think it's one of the really challenging things that the Catholic tradition gives to the world, which is this idea that it's not purely spiritual, that actually the body has this incredible heart and is with the spirit, and it's not a case of leaving one behind so that you can fulfill the other. I think that's really challenging, because I think our tendency is to assume that the things of the body are the things that we need to leave behind.
Yeah, I think that was well said.
Then our remaining joy is to thank our presenters for their work. So.
This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.